right, I think we're going to get started, and it's like basically 1:30. We're doing all right on time. Nice job, everybody. My name is Gina Sampaio. If we haven't met, I'm the curator of the museum now. And if you've ever heard me speak before, I've mentioned before how much my interest in history has less to do with battles and dates to remember and the things they taught us in class like that, and more about how common people lived and survived and loved. And I love this book because it does that with two different families in two different time periods. So it's so interesting to have the perspective in the same place and in the same house of two different families from a century apart, or more than a century apart, living right here in Lebanon Township. So if you haven't read it, we do have copies for sale for $5, by the way. And I just wanted to thank the Historians Committee. They put together a really nice spread back there, as you may have seen, lots to eat and drink. However, I just wanted to mention that the people that worked the hardest on this exhibit, Maria Nacarado from the Historians Committee, my assistant Robbie Linwangi, and myself have decided that we're going to offer a pop quiz before you're allowed to get any food or drink, because we want to see if anybody's reading all the little signs that we worked so hard to put all over the place. So see me afterwards for your pop quiz. Before I go on, do I need to say anything else? I don't think so. I just want to introduce, before we get started with the book readings, Jay Langley is here as the executive editor from when this book was published, but he did say before that his wife was the publisher, and everybody knows the publisher is the boss.
Exactly.
So
right.
this is a man that I like, and I'm going to introduce to say a few words now. Thank you, Jay.
Thanks. $5, man. I think it cost us $4 a piece to publish this, so it's a good deal. Well, thanks for including me in today's event. It's been a good week going through some old materials, thinking back, got out my desk calendars from those years, and I was telling I put little sticky things on the calendar pages that said, "Meet with Sal." And by the time I was done with those 3 years, the calendars looked like porcupines. So we spent a lot of time talking to one another about some of his ideas, and then eventually it turned into a book. Sal was one of my favorite people, and this book, The Ride to Pleasant Grove, has always been one of my favorite projects. As many of you know, the book has two parts. One is a narrative poem that takes readers along with elderly farmer James Hance as he thinks back about his life and his land and thinks ahead about how to write his will. It's a tour de force of local history between the American Revolution and the Civil War, set in a period when many people hereabouts were giving up their played-out farms and moving west. The other part of the book, my favorite part, tells how Sal and his wife Teresa acquired that same farm many years later, and how they followed the clues they found in the house and in the land itself to understand its long lineage and their own places in it. The reason I'm involved is that for a long time I was executive editor of the Hunterdon County Democrat newspapers, and my wife Catherine was the publisher. And for those of you who did not know it, the publisher is the one who writes the checks, so she's the boss. As a side project, we started a book division named after Catherine's grandfather, D.H. Moreau, who had started publishing the paper in 1922. And by the time we met Sal, we had published several books of local interest by local authors. Here's what I recall about how we produced The Ride to Pleasant Grove. In the mid-1990s, when Sal visited me quite often at the newspaper, it was hard to convince people that we were working. If I kept my office door open, our enthusiasm and our laughter disturbed the reporters, who were trying to write articles or to conduct interviews. But closing my door was no good either, because then Sal and I forgot they were out there. Our laughter got louder, and our conversations went longer. Looking back through my desk calendars from those years, I see that we addressed this problem, and the fact that our weekday schedules were always crammed, by starting to meet on weekend mornings when we had the building to ourselves. Then we could chat as long as we wanted about whatever came to mind. And with Sal, things always came to mind. We discussed his writing project, of course, and the history of Hunterdon County. We told stories about our families and bragged about our wives and children. We talked about old-timers we had known and retold their stories, keeping alive the oral tradition for another little while. We talked about land preservation and development trends, and Sal's strong belief that preserving Hunterdon's open space would be key to supplying clean water for New Jersey's future, a concept that he called water farms. He thought the folks who operated good water farms should be paid like any other farmers who produce any other crops for people to consume. I thought enough of Sal's hypothesis to assign a series of articles on the subject and to endorse his ideas with several editorials. Thus far to no avail, as with many editorials. We recommended authors to each other. I urged him to read the boyhood tales of Hayden Pearson, one of our columnists, who was raised on an apple farm just before World War I. Sal insisted that I read Conrad Richter's trilogy about Midwestern pioneers and their struggles. The three books are The Trees, The Fields, and The Town. This week I took The Town off my shelf and, opening at random, read several lines. I had to chuckle at how much Richter's verb placements and the rhythm of his language reminded me of Sal's writing about long-ago farmer James Hance and the other characters in the ride to Pleasant Grove. In Richter's foreword lies the explanation. He has written in the mode of thought and speech of those pioneer times, and in their cadences. I'd forgotten. That's where Sal got the idea of what James Hance's thoughts might sound like. Sal was easy to talk to and always enthusiastic. To set the scene of our first meeting, I should say that in some ways a newspaper office was like a big grammar school. People were always coming in for show and tell. They brought arrowheads or a gold nugget that Uncle Harvey got in the Yukon, where they showed us the letter great-granddad wrote after charging up San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt. Some brought in summer squashes that looked like Napoleon or Abraham Lincoln. I told reporters that no matter what people said, no matter how odd or mundane, it was our job to listen and to consider. So, when this guy named Sal, who looked a lot like a lumberjack, showed up one day with his poem about a long-ago farmer driving to church in his wagon, the people at our front desk chuckled to themselves and sent him to me. I listened and said, in essence, really? So this guy drove to church in a wagon 150 years ago. What's the story? And Sal, being Sal, went into sales mode. and said something like, "Yeah, let me tell you about it. It's fascinating." I should note that in newspapering, there is a long-standing but unwritten rule that boils down to this: no poetry. Not ever. And that's what the old-timers told me when I was a young reporter, because that's what they'd been told. But over the years, I've done my own research. And actually, in James Hance's day, local newspapers had very little local news in them. On the front page, they serialized novels. They ran long political speeches by national figures. And they ran long narrative poems. I knew this because I'd read many of our own papers from the years that Sal was writing about. I had come to understand that on lonely farms in mud time, or in the dead of winter, in the days before automobiles, telephones, radio, television, cable, and now streaming, a newspaper was a breath of life and imagination for isolated, farm-bound families. And in talking with Sal, I began to see a way to discuss that history and to honor that heritage, if only for a few moments in the busy sweep of modern life. He came in originally to ask if we'd be willing to publish his James Hance poem as a pamphlet or a leaflet, and after reading it, I said, no. I couldn't see how we'd sell 10 copies. But if he could scare up some sort of illustrations, I said, we would serialize the thing in 4 weekly installments, 4 full broadsheet pages in all 25,000 copies of our newspaper. So Sal spoke with artist Doris Keller-Terrace, who produced a watercolor imagining of James Hance on his wagon with his horse in harness. Sal spoke with Teresa, and she drew several sketches that helped set the scenes and tell the story. And off we went. Some readers really liked it. So the serialization came and went, but Sal and I kept talking. What would it take, we wondered, to make the ride to Pleasant Grove into a book? Well, I said, I know you don't want to hear this, but the stories you keep telling me about you and Teresa and the girls devoting so much time and energy and care to renovating your home and property, those stories would be more interesting to many readers than a long poem about dead people on a worn-out farm. So why on earth did you do all that research, I asked, and all that work, when you could have just raised the rubble of the old house and built a new one? It's a fair question. Go write that story. Tell us what you did and why you did it, together with the poem. I think that would be a terrific book. Sal looked like I'd slapped him. He said, "You want me to write more?" "Yeah," I said, "and with lots of footnotes. Give us all your stories, digressions, old photos, all the details about how you found out X, and who told you Y, and how you concluded Z. All that background crap you've been telling me here in this office. Your passion for this, that's what's interesting. Sweep us up in the thrill of the chase. How could a fairly normal, modern couple let this happen? That's the story." But I was done writing, said Sal. After, I don't know, here I put 12 years, but between the research and the writing and all that, after 12 years, now you want more? Yes, I said, but only if you want a book. Because that, by jingo, that would be a book we could be proud of. He wasn't happy, but Sal said he'd talk with Teresa and they'd think about it, which they did. And here we are, 20-odd years later, applauding their decisions. My wife, Catherine, made time in her packed schedule as publisher to design the book and to oversee printing and binding. And my desk calendar for 1999 tells me that on June 9th, I drove 2 boxes of brand new books to the Clinton bookstore, where Sal gave a reading the following week. After its own long, long journey, the ride to Pleasant Grove was born. It was one of the best projects I ever worked on. But my lasting memories are of talking with Sal and laughing our heads off, in between all the serious stuff. I'll never forget his humor, his painstaking research, his devotion to Teresa and the girls, and his enthusiasm to explore and share a time and a place. So I urge you to enjoy, or if you've read it already, to re-enjoy The Ride to Pleasant Grove. As an old newspaper guy, that's my headline. Read all about it. Thanks. Terry reminded me, I'd forgotten, that we actually met during Lamaze classes when she and Catherine were both pregnant. And
we had the babies in the same
we had the kids to prove it too.
That's why I actually told Sal, I says, maybe Jay, you know, we know him kind of.
So,
Well, thank you, Jay.
if you got any questions, I'm happy to talk. If not, that's fine.
Does anybody have any questions, or will we? You can ask them later too. You're not going anywhere, are you?
Nope.
That's good. You didn't take your pop quiz yet, so. Next, I just want to introduce Sal's daughter, Celia, who's also going to do a little speaking before we do the book readings.
Thank you. Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. It means a lot to our family to share this exhibit with you. My name is Celia. I'm the middle child of Sal and Terry Vuocolo, joined today by my mom, Terry, and my younger sister, Allison. Sister Bianca is at home, but she sends her well wishes. When I first started speaking with the museum about doing a project like this, one of the first things that they asked me was, what do I remember from my dad writing this book? And I was like, oh yeah, I remember. First thing that came to my head was being about 10 years old, being in the middle of summer, and my dad taking me and both of my sisters to some stuffy library in Trenton to hunt down some fact that he had found out about James Hance, and we just had to know what it was. And it sucked. It was the worst. I mean, you're 10 years old, it's the last place you want to be is some hot, stuffy library. But he was like that. He was very tenacious, and he spent years and years researching this book and learning about our farm. I think the second memory that comes to mind is actually a time when he was probably 5 years later, and he was actually physically writing the book. And I remember my mom sitting on the bed with papers in front of her, and him sitting in the desk chair, and they were discussing it. Often what would happen is he would write something, and then he would give it to her to read and, you know, edit as necessary. So he really, really valued her opinion, and it was one of those things that would happen on a regular basis in our house. Something interesting about our parents, if you don't know them well, is they embarked on a pretty special journey in their lives. they decided, this is probably the late 70s, to move across the country, to move into my dad's parents' house, we lived in Brereton at the time, and spend over a year fixing up a very dilapidated house, which was not livable for a long time, and basically take all of us along on this journey. And it was really interesting growing up there. I often joke that I feel like we grew up in the 1880s, not the 1980s, because that's really what it was like, as you can see from some of these photos. It was still very rustic, and as kids, we were learning about things like how to make our own dolls, or how to identify trees, or how to take care of lambs when our classmates were out, skiing or buying the next Cabbage Patch doll or something exciting like that. But I will say that it was a really special way to grow up, and I think Allison would agree that it's made us very, unique people. Right now I actually work as a wildlife ecologist for a land trust in Virginia, and there's not, a day that goes by that I don't use something that I learned or experienced at the farm in my own job. So, how many people here knew my dad, just out of curiosity? So yeah. One of the things about him, when you would first meet him or just see him, you haven't seen him in a long time, was his charisma. Jay touched on that a little bit in his talk. Very, very charismatic, and he always wanted to talk to people, make them comfortable, and kind of understand where they were coming from. It was very important to him. And I think that's translated in the way that he writes. I've talked to a lot of folks over the years that have read his book. Everybody takes something a little bit different from it. Sure, it's about James Hance, it's about farming, it's about Lebanon Township, but it's more than that. It's about family generations, it's about the immigrant experience, it's about, birth, death, and life, most of all. So, I guess with that, I just want to thank everybody, especially the museum. Maria and Gina have been so great in working with our family to put this together. So without further ado, I think we can start. Yeah.
Thank you, Celia. Did you want to say anything about your meeting in the past with Sal? Please.
Okay, so my name is Pam Casserly. I am still a friend of Vuocolos, but was a friend of Sal. And Sal and I used to go different places and do readings from this book in different historical societies. I remember he wanted me to do this Irish accent, and scary to me. And I actually had a friend who was from Ireland, and I used to go to her house, and she would coach me in it, but I never felt comfortable. So if there is going to be like an Irish speaker today in anything that I read, it's just going to be Pam's accent. So. Okay, so I'm going to start.
I just want to say that we're going to read, we're going to do a reading now from the first part of the book, and then we'll just take a little break, and then we'll read from the poems later. So, yes, we can start whenever you're ready.
I was 12 when my parents bought the old Hance farm. It was the early 1960s and the beginning of the end of family farming in New Jersey. At the time, Hunterdon County was a landscape of soft rolling hills, spread wide in a quilt-like pattern of green and brown. Those were the last years of agrarian calm before the land's transformation into bedroom communities. The old farm families who gave the landscape its shape were no match for the powerful post-World War II real estate boom. Hunterdon farmland sold at record prices. Farm families sold to non-farmers, effectively upsetting the long-established social and economic order. My parents didn't know it then, but they bought the farm that had been owned by James Hance and his family during the mid-1800s. It is located in what used to be called Anthonytown, named after early farmers Philip and Daniel Anthony. The area is the highest point in the hilly northern part of Lebanon Township.
Owning land during the post-war years was considered a safe bet. Everyone believed in its value without question. For my parents, family responsibilities and the unpredictability of life kept them from doing anything with their new farm except holding on to it. Eventually, the carriage barn and the outbuildings collapsed, the main barn having done so in the 1930s. The fields, abandoned since the Great Depression, merged with the farmyard into a single overgrowth. The long lane to the municipal road closed in on itself. The house no longer kept out the weather. Built sometime around 1800, The stone house was home to landowning farmers until 1895. Thereafter, a series of city-dwelling landlords owned it until the 1960s. The lack of care during those years allowed the early domestic vernacular of the buildings and landscape, evidence of what had been a faithful commitment to life on that farm, to crumble quietly. Inside the house, the wide board floors and small rooms appeared too fragile for the daily routine of a farm family. Downstairs, a back room was closed off with a window in an odd place. It was damp and dusty. The smell of ancient wood smoke was everywhere. Outside, a wall of encroaching vegetation sealed off the rest of the world.
The small stone house reminded me of a storybook cottage, a safe haven from a hostile world. Ostensibly, it had a familiar story. People were born, lived, and died here. Spring water came up out of the ground into the house. The huge fireplace and bake oven had sustained those who used them. The stone and heavy timbers for the home's construction probably came from the very ground upon which it sat. In this sense, the house is a rare achievement, actually an improvement over what was there before. For me, it remains apart and unlike any house I have ever been in. It is a place unto itself. As the land was taken over by non-farmers, our society's respect for the way farming kept the world at arm's length was lost. Since much of the land was no longer productive, neighbors no longer bought produce, cut firewood, took sons hunting and fishing, or in general enjoyed a way of life supported by a thriving farm economy. Increasing real estate values overtook the stewardship activities. People, cars, and traffic congested skinny, twisting roads, crowding out the tranquility once inspired by the open space of actively farmed land.
The fading farm economy dimmed the collective memory of the farm community. Many new residents pass local landmarks each day without any knowledge of what they are or how they affected their community. Many times I've heard old-timers lament the lack of background among new arrivals. Background in this sense means, of course, an understanding of what transpired in the years before they came here. If there was truly joyous aspect to my usually solitary research, it was the time spent listening to old-timers' fading memories. Formal and informal interviews, social visits, meandering phone conversations, walks on farm roads, back porch storytelling, helping a neighbor load hay, looking over old photo albums on the kitchen table, Saturday afternoons in the Township Museum. Lingering exchanges after Sunday worship all help to fill in some of that missing background.
Today's farmers have in common with those from 1850 their roles as people who work and care for the land. They produce food, families, and by extension, they support stable, healthy communities. Towns like Califon and Clinton were able to thrive mainly because of surrounding farms. Despite all the social changes brought by the real estate frenzy, there is no escaping the strong attachment that individuals have to the place, urban or rural, that they call home. The more effort they invest in it, the stronger the attachment. By 1991, we had spent 14 years working on our home and our farm. All that while, I had been researching the history of this land and its people. The two were about to come together in a way that uplifted and inspired me, and which led, ultimately, to my writing a long poem about James Hance and his family. Writing that story eventually led me to write this one, which is the story behind that poem.
It's not correct.
One Sunday morning, we woke to find a fallen tree blocking our lane. A late winter storm had left 6 inches of snow and ice downing wires and trees. The early signs of spring were evident as I drove the tractor to the edge of the first field. After sawing and clearing the remains of the tree, I shut off the saw and tractor to cinch a chain securely around the log. The ear-pounding noise became instant silence. From the west, I heard the faint sound of organ music. I recognized it as coming from the neighbor who lives half a mile away, beside the ruins of the old Mount Bethel Church, known locally as Swack Church. In that brief moment of quiet music, I was hearing what James Hance might have heard all those years ago, when that church full of Lutherans raised their voices in reverent song. Instantly, that newly opened field was filled with the vision of a pre-industrial man living an ordered life. The only sound James Hance would have heard would have been those made by the weather, his farm animals, his family, or people he knew. Other than this, there was only the silence of passing time, and all those years of dedicated toil. For me, this day was more quiet than most, with the road closed by the storm. The wind in the trees made a stiff, banging noise like an old man beating his cane against a door. My sense of time was lost in the white solitude of clearing the tree from the lane. This same job would have been a disruption for Hance. For me, it was a brief chance to experience the passage of time as it might have been for those people who lived before so many machines altered human life. Before the Industrial Revolution, God was the center of life. From him came everyone's understanding of nature and time. Things like working in the fields or helping in the neighbor's farm had a meaning defined by their cultural context, unregimented by time as we know it today. Most people embraced the Industrial Revolution when it reached them. Wittingly or not, they also redefined their relationship with God as the influence of machines increased. At some point, the train whistle would have been heard as it came into Changewater. The day's schedule then might come to be organized around that disquieting sound as it rose from the valley, overpowering the familiar voices raised in praise of the Lord.
I finished clearing the fallen tree and headed the old tractor back up the lane. Its soft rattling and gurgling, the crunching snow under its large rear tires, muted the sound of the organ music coming through the trees. Deep drifting snow rounded the stone rows into a white ocean of frozen waves. The front tripod tires of the old tractor parted the snow like a boat cutting through the water. I unloaded the cut-up tree in the firewood stack at the top of the lane. Falling snow already was filling in the tracks of the lane. There have been several similar unexpected moments during the years that I have spent at work on this farm. The result has been that this land and I have formed a bond both personal and solitary. I have been given time to think, learn, and watch things grow. At this writing, my earliest research notes are 15 years old, yet the task of uncovering the whole story of this farm is unfinished. Some questions may never be answered. Who these early people were, where they came from, why they came here, and how long they stayed. How they survived, how they used the land, how they farmed. What they carried in their hands, drank, ate, what grew in their fields. How they worshiped and thought about God. Where they went to school, what they thought about. How they related to each other and the outside world. The more I wonder, the more I realize that this history, in this sense that it is traditionally taught, is a very small part of a large and intricate picture. For me, the key to understanding life on this farm 150 years ago was to learn firsthand about the soil and its capability. Ultimately, the story of the generation after Hance would be happy or sad depending on the condition of the soil as it was left to them. The hopes and dreams of well-intentioned parents aside, the soil's capability was a determining factor in an early farm struggle to sustain itself from one generation to the next. That's the conclusion of the first part of the reading, so please enjoy some snacks and drinks, and then we'll read from the poems later. Thank you.
I have to say that I can hear his voice as I'm reading this, because I had already read it and then I reread it again last week, so yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you for having me.
The poems selected, I think that some of them you've done in the past with Sal. Celia suggested some, and then we added one more that I was interested in doing. Called Two Stones. Not only was I interested in it, we also have a photograph that goes along with that poem. So once again, check that out later, please. So, all right, Pam, I think you have the first of the poems.
This poem is called Morning. James Hance's eyes, walnut brown and deeply set, were the first part of his anatomy to appear in the doorway. Without looking, Hance released the latch. Spry, slightly bent, he glided through the doorway and in one motion closed it behind him. A movement more resembling a deft dance floor move than a farmer emerging from morning chores. The hilltop view transformed him, looking out over the farm, even if only for a moment, as if to check his work against a carefully drawn blueprint. He noted the presence and condition of each building, fence post, gate, grazing animal, even the smoke from the morning fire, and the corresponding void in the wood pile, denoting how much was taken in that morning. By the gray thickness of the smoke, he knew Mary had just started the fire. Breakfast would be a while. He bit into his pipe. In that instant, it all seemed as it should. Down the lane, he could almost see the youngish gray wisp of a man that was he, riding up the lane, seeing for the first time the scarred, cut-over woodland. Even then, he knew he would build the barn there on the hill overlooking the house. A sharp wind dumped cold air on him like a bucket of water under his shirt and down his back. He straightened, moving just enough to stir the crows out of the orchard and into the late winter sky. 2 red tails joined the fray. The horses jerked their heads up, as did the sheep grazing under the apple trees. His eyes shot back past the house and orchard, west directly into the wind glaring at it. There on the hilltop, the gray cloud-filled sky swept closer like a great colorless quilt being drawn over him, too late for an already chilled old man. Wood smoke fragrance and the notion of sitting down to breakfast with Mary moved him quickly down the hill and into the house.
2 stones. Hance slowed as he recognized the horseman as the Reverend Lambert Swackhammer. Known throughout as a devout man of God and foe of slavery, Hance warmed at the sight of this kindred spirit. The founding minister of the Mount Bethel Church, he inspired its construction in 1844. Built on the bend in Anthonytown Road, it was right on Hance's line. Unique among country churches, it had a well-patronized library. Just east of the church was a log home built for Lambert and his Scottish wife, Janet McNaughton. A honey-throated tenor, he stirred his congregation with song and sermon, but he failed to convince the New York Synod to pass a resolution denouncing slavery as a sin in the sight of God. For the Synod, the slavery question was political, not religious. Speaking to Hance in the steady manner of a man who understands his work, Swackhammer reported that he had granted permission for the burial of an ex-slave woman behind the church. Formerly the property of Mark Thompson, congressman and ironmaster of the Changewater Furnace, she was the last member of the only ex-slave family to remain. Her grave was marked in the biblical fashion, with 2 stones, one atop the other. Standing over her grave in final prayers, alone in the corner of the cemetery where the stone rows separate the farm fields, he asked God's forgiveness for the former owners and opened to Genesis, placing 2 stones on her grave as he read, "And Jacob rose up and took 2 stones and set them for a pillar and poured oil on it. He called the name of that place Bethel. And this stone, which I have set for a pillar, shall be God's house." Hance's son-in-law, Daniel, said it was the passage he always read wherever there was a burial and no gravestone. 2 restrained backcountry men, secluded in their individual lives, upholding their convictions, united for a brief moment on that commonest of roads.
This poem is called Mary's Promise. The horse's head lifted higher and harder as the carriage made its way up the shoulder of the ridge where Spruce Run begins. Great circles of black earth, surrounded by an army of charred stumps, the aftermath of some long-ago charcoal maker, paralyzed the regeneration of this northern upland forest. It was a clearing that no one wanted. Cheap land, now that the iron forges are gone. 2 of rock, 1 of dirt, disapproving farmers always said, even though it was the cheap land that brought them there, thin and already tired. There at that black spot, Hance recalled how it all began. Small dark figures in the trees, sawing branches, larger, older men on the ground cutting small trees. All of them together, taking down whatever remained. They didn't know then that once the forest was cleared away, there would be no falling leaves each year to build the soil. Nor did they know that by taking out the roots of the once proud family of trees embracing the hillside land, the soil would wash away, causing the stones to come endlessly out of the ground, like a sick old man unable to keep his innards down. Each spring, the children, as if in a funeral procession, followed the plow, picking rocks, making stone rolls, routinely like any other chore. Until the day Mary came running, struggling with her skirts in the muddy field, yelling, "Stop it, James Hance. You're working the children too hard, lifting rocks all day with their small hands. It's a cruel sight. I'm not going to drive them away like all the others." Children, father, horse, and plow stood still and ankle deep in the smell of damp soil. James, all I can think of is the promise I made to my mother the day I left Ireland. I will always remember her face deformed by the mother's plague of children departing forever. I can still see her in front of the old house, empty as a tomb, standing frozen like a palace guard, looking out at the carriages on the Dunleavy Road, each facing the opposite way. Each day, for 5 generations, there was a fire in the hearth. She used to say that the word hearth came from putting your heart in one place on the earth. Once there, just keep the fire day after day. Letting the fire go out chilled our hearts. Mother was left behind with just herself to think about. Bringing the children in, she repeated the promise clearly so that the children could hear. Never again a broken family.
Through the crossroads. The Pleasant Grove Church shared the crossroads with the Jug Tavern, the church on one side, the tavern on the other. For Hance, this situational paradox was no different than the paradox of poverty and pride lived by these backcountry men. Their unbroken occupation of the tavern bore witness to their diminished status as descendants of the ancient borderer heritage of warrior farmers. They now lived in a peaceful place, where the only hostility was to bountiful agriculture. Next to the tavern, the stubble of green-gray orange lichens bundled an old wagon body like a speckled quilt. It was the bed of a charcoal wagon, jettisoned in the corner of a field, stripped of all useful parts and upended, stark as a tombstone. Built for Mark Thompson, ironmaster of the Changewater Furnace, and sold in the sale mandated by the New Jersey legislature in 1828 to pay Thompson's debts. An indignity so public, so complete. Too many died the same way, some even as paupers. Others moved west, fleeing creditors they could not pay, only to have them visit upon the family members who had stayed behind. No matter where he looked, it required a great leap of faith to proceed. Not unlike his 2-legged frog jumps he made as a boy, trying to clear the creek behind his house before his heels hit the water, he always knew he would make it, in part because he so badly wanted to. It came to him like the blast of light in his face when he stepped out of the barn in the morning sun. Are these not my children? Did I not teach them, live life with them, give them what I could? I've seen too many men in the Jug Tavern at the crossroads unable to proceed or recognize that their families know them as much through the work of their life as through their faith. Proceeding through the crossroads, Hance looked ahead to the road home, enlightened by his realization that his children know him as everyone else knows him. An immigrant son with a simple hillside farm, possessing a loving wife and family, with a strong feeling for God and from whence he came.
Roots. Where the top of the ridge becomes too rocky and wet, farmhouses look more like temporary miner shacks. Spruce Run is more a swamp and less a stream. Coyotes and bear terrorize the back country at will. Hance's wagon passed the last of the cleared, silent farm fields to his left. To his right, soft, black, table-sized stumps outnumbered vigorous hardwood growth. The faint breath of a tired kitchen fire was too distant to reassure him. It was a silent, transitional place. A singular, smallish figure of a man appeared amongst the trees, as dark as the bark of a tree. Hance saw the old Lenape slowly turn away from him, imperceptibly crouching down like a man hunkering before a campfire. With widened eyes, Hance looked as the figure turned toward him again. its face transformed into the long snout and vibrant yellow eyes of a coyote. His spine shot straight up like a man thrown back by a bolting horse. The mare continued along in her steady, knowing pace. Looking back again, the solitary Indian scraped at something in the dirt. Roots, thought Hance. He's looking for sassafras roots. The Lenape stood up as soon as he saw Hance looking at him. Approaching the road, he looked less dark and furtive, and closer he came. Hance stopped. The Indian spoke. "Your wagon is dark and in death." Hance stared at his eyes, reassuring himself that they were not yellow. "Your time is coming, but it is not yet. You must think of your father and his father. Each was a good man who gave much to those who came after him. Think of them and their stories." As he spoke those last words, his one hand came to rest up to the front wheel of the wagon. Hance looked down to see his hand pull away. Looking back to the old Lenape, he saw instead the graceful lope of a mature coyote gliding through the trees and down the ridge.
Lebanon. Weary, holding the reins too tight, Hance wanted to be home. His father always said that there was better land than this, where the roads were not as rough, farms more productive, and life not as isolated. But this was Lebanon, the place where his father had come. As the old Lenape told it, 4 redcoats came among us in the night, smelling of fear, trading their coats like snakes shedding their skins, and not to be trusted. Hance's father remained on Mount Lebanon, the highest point so named for the home place of the Tree of God. In the whiteness of his isolation among the deforested ruins, his feet rooted to the remnants of this green grove. Like the ancient holy place, where Solomon's woodsman made God's mountain forest a barren limestone desert, there's a river to the north, the Musconetcong, and one to the South Branch, fed by the waters of the limestone ridges, dotted with homespun village outposts. In this high forest fortress, it was as Lebanon, that place described so often in the Old Testament. It was from here that Hance's father looked up and began his conversation with God.
Clarissa. Sliding off the wagon, Hance stood tentatively on the thin crust of ice. Like walking on eggs, he thought, mostly shuffling, partly walking, toward the horse, knee-deep in mud and mire. He broke through twice, sinking up to his knee in muck. The horse, once freed from the harness, struggled out through the mud and onto the lane. One hand on the bridle, the other holding the quilt wrapped around him, Hance walked up the lane. In the orange-purple dusk, Hance relived daughter Clarissa running, full of excitement, announcing the birth of 2 more lambs. She decorated the pen with yellow-white Easter lilies picked from behind the house. From then on, they became Clarissa's lilies, Clarissa's lambs. And when the berries, apples, peaches, wildflowers, even the first frogs out from under the pond were in fullness, she was there, marking the occasion with such exuberant announcements and tender marveling that they all became Clarissas. Indeed, she bore the imprint of this simple place from those early times into womanhood. It was only natural that she be born, live, and die here. She married the German Daniel Schleicher, the first of the family to marry outside of the kinship. But they were all Americans now, owning land, enjoying peace. Emerging from the barn, Daniel walked toward Hance. Silently, he passed control of the bridle to Daniel, who took the mare. Hance heard Clarissa's voice from inside the barn, half talking, half singing to the animals. Turning toward the house, he walked quickly, knowing Mary was inside.
Evening. There will always be the moving away. The railroad men brashly speaking of progress, the rush to Americanize family names and way of life, the willingness to give themselves not to God, but to a ticking menace bluntly carried in vest pockets. Anxious farmers now rush to the sound of the train's steam whistle, with wagon loads for sale to unseen people in faraway cities.
Slowly, life became easier, less tiresome, and neighbors spoke proudly of family doing well in places like Ohio, Kentucky, and Missouri. Yet all of the changes in a lifetime of conversation with Mary could not displace his sense of who he was. Many saw in him what used to be Anthonytown, and all that it took to make this hill country what it is now.
But Hance was no longer the future, just as the landscape was not what it once was. That part of the Trinity had changed inexorably. The balance would not. Family and God unquestionably remained his sun and moon.
Ultimately, Hance accepted that this land was changed forever by their eternal pursuit of progress and betterment. What the land once was now embodied within him, hardy, thin, and fertile only to those who took the time to know him.
Outside in the dark, the cold ground began unfurling to another spring advance. Daniel and Clarissa at the barn on the top of the hill, standing for a moment to acknowledge the day's end, saw in the darkness the soft orange glow of the oil lamp moving slowly within the dark house, indicating that James and Mary Hance were going from dinner through the doorway, up the winding stairs, to sleep.